and then just give it a second. All right, I think we're recording. Hi, James. How's it going?
Hi, how you doing?
Not bad. Thanks for getting in touch with me. So we had touched base earlier. I think it was last week after I talked with Pastor Fisher. Can you just explain what you and your partner do, kind of your organization? You're a nonprofit, right?
Yeah, so we're a nonprofit charity. So we function on voluntary private donations, just like any other charity. That's the entirety of our revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Most of that comes from small everyday donors who just give small regular amounts year after year. We've been around for about 10 years, and we're very grateful for that. So we function much like a law firm in the sense that we litigate a large number of cases. But obviously there's a huge difference with that because we don't charge our clients anything. Not only for legal fees, we also pay for disbursements, which can be thousands and thousands of dollars for a case between filing fees and printing and traveling and all the rest of it. We pay for all of that. So there's absolutely no cost to the people who we represent. And we're able to do that because of the donations, right? So we're very unique that way with the number of cases that we litigate, the number of people that we represent, and that we're able to help without any cost. So, we do a little bit of education and advocacy and speaking and all that stuff as part and parcel, but the primary activity, what we do is just going to court and fighting and sometimes winning, hopefully winning lots to defend people's rights.
Mm-hmm. So I got your name from one of the pastors that I had done an audio interview with earlier. His name was Chad Fisher. He's a pastor at Cornerstone here in Edmonton. But can you explain how that connection, like between you, him, and myself, kind of came up?
So the biggest part of what we do is the fundamental freedom section of the Charter, which is what protects our civil liberties in the Canadian Constitution. And Section 2 protects the fundamental freedoms, or what is called the fundamental freedoms in that document. And those are the freedoms of conscience and religion, of peaceful assembly, of association, and of thought, opinion, and expression, including the media. So it's very common for us to be running a lot of freedom of religion cases, which means we're often defending individual Christians, Christian churches, obviously sometimes people of other faith backgrounds. So we've defended Christian schools in the past, and so in this situation, there's a lot of pastors and churches that would have already been aware of us and the work that we've done in Alberta, especially with the Christian schools. So they reached out to us, right? Because there's not a lot of places you can go for expertise in constitutional law and not have to pay a lot for it. And that's part of what we're here for, right? We want people to reach out when stuff like this happens, right? When governments take a lot of control and courts close down, which is an unprecedented situation. But that's exactly the kind of situation where what we do becomes really important, and we're ready to go. We're ready to advise people, to represent people, and to help people to assert their rights. Rights are kind of like muscles. If you don't use them, you lose them. Mm-hmm. And so they need to be asserted. They need to be defended and protected by people who do what we do and know what we know. And so he's part of a number of churches that have reached out to us that we are advising on how best to assert their rights and navigate these very, very difficult waters where undoubtedly their constitutional rights are being violated, but they're trying to be reasonable and respectful of government and honoring of people both in and outside their congregations. And so but they can't just sit there and continue to have those rights violated indefinitely. There has to be a way to move forward.
Right. So when we talk about the kind of impact that COVID-19 and the government restrictions had, specifically with the government restrictions, can you speak to what charter rights in Alberta were affected by these restrictions when it comes to religious practices or, religious organizations like churches, mosques, that kind of thing?
So religious organizations and churches and religious people, it's a little bit unique, of course, compared to the rest of society, because meeting physically together on a regular basis is so important and fundamental.
Hmm.
They don't just do it for social interaction. I mean, they do in the sense that everybody does. Everybody needs that.
Yeah.
But there's just certain ways that people manifest their faith that can only be done physically in person with other people.
Yeah, this was something Pastor Chad and I talked about, where actually Pastor Rice, not Chad, sorry, I misspoke there. He was another one of the pastors kind of involved in the first number of interviews, where we tend to forget that church is the English word. We're called the ecclesia through scriptures and church history, the literal gathering. And so like separating that is a weird thing that we've kind of been thrust into with this situation. And so it's not just a social norm, it's actually built into the name of us in some regards. So that has to get wrestled with.
Yeah, I was on a call this morning with pastors, and one of them said, how do you baptize over Zoom? How do you do communion virtually, right? These things are physical. It requires touch and interaction. So there's grave violations of religious freedom here, and they're not targeted in the sense that the government is trying to stop the exercise of faith because of the content of the faith, or because of the content of the beliefs, or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So which I think is that was kind of difficult for people to process at first, because people looked around and said, okay, well, there's no unique discrimination here. We're not being told we can't speak something from the pulpit. We're not being told that we can't do a particular practice because it's somehow disapproved of. And the types of religious discrimination we've experienced prior to this were a little more targeted and unique, right?
Right.
The government would say, well, we can't tolerate that belief that you have, right? You have an unpopular belief about sexuality or something to do with human nature, something to do with. So because we can't tolerate that, we're gonna penalize you for that belief. We're gonna penalize you for expressing that belief. You're not allowed to express that belief and function in this part of society. That's the sort of stuff we were used to. Now it's you can't gather, and neither can anybody else. So it's not just you.
Yeah, so it was a blanket on all religions that have that as part of their their expression of faith. So like mosques, temples, churches, it was just a one size fits all from the government that no one really wanted to squeeze into.
The problem with that is the effect is so much worse on religious people than it is on I guess the non-religious person who doesn't regularly go to church. So that's the freedom of religion and freedom of conscience violation. The next one, of course, is freedom of assembly, right?
Right.
We have freedom of peaceful assembly, and part of the purpose of that is to protect these very important fundamental aspects of society, such as gathering for religious purposes. Now, most people probably don't realize this. That freedom is utterly undeveloped in Canada. There's barely any case law discussing freedom of assembly, and certainly not at any high level of court. The Christian Legal Fellowship did a little piece here a little while ago on the forgotten freedoms, and that was one of the ones that was in there, of course, because it is essentially a forgotten freedom. It never needs to be asserted. It's never been really violated at all. I mean, this would be the only significant violation of freedom of assembly since the charter came out over 30 years ago.
And that includes even non-religious assembly, like even just like 40 people gathering after a soccer game, that like the right to do so, that would include that, right?
Yes.
But what we would call like general fellowship as a religious term, but like, yeah, if you're just a bunch of people together with a stated or non-stated reason, right?
Yes, your protection to do so is heightened when you're gathering for the purposes of religious practices, for the purposes of political expression, expressing, basically a political protest, right? We've seen that just here in the last few days.
Yeah.
A ton of those in North America. So freedom of assembly, like any fundamental freedom, there's things it protects and then things it really protects.
Right.
And often the phrase in the courts is it goes to the core, right? Some things go to the core of these freedoms more than others.
Right.
Freedom of assembly does protect the right to assemble, and I would argue it does. We don't have case law on this, so I can't speak authoritatively based on what the Supreme Court of Canada has said. But in my opinion, it would protect just a group of people getting together at the park, right? For no particular purpose. But when there is a purpose, that protection is heightened.
Right.
right? And so obviously when you're going to church, you're at the core of what freedom of assembly protects.
Right.
And I
Like
mean,
the rights kind of double down on each other in a
they
sense.
do. So the rights, they interweave and support each other, right? They have their unique spheres where it's only that right maybe protecting a particular activity, but a lot of activities that one right protects is protected by others.
Okay.
And in this case, there's another one, which would be freedom of association, right? Which is a little bit different than assembly, because the idea with association is that people can form groups and have them and do things within them and decide who can be in the group and who not, and they can do group activities, and that isn't necessarily, of course, physically in person, right? So
right.
But those three, I see them overlapping. When people are getting together as a church on a Sunday morning, going to their church building, they're exercising those three freedoms.
Right.
Right. And I mean, they're obviously exercising freedom of expression too, but in the context of the public health restrictions, those are the three that are normally being exercised and that are being explicitly violated by the public health orders.
Yeah. So now I know this has changed in the last week here, I think maybe two, but what is the total max attendance allowed for any kind of grouping now? I know at one point it was as low as 15 in any given area with social distancing in place. But could you go into detail of what like the current situation is on June 3rd today, if you can?
So the current situation in Alberta is that, at least for churches, you can gather at 50 people indoors. That number is a little bit odd just because it's coupled with a restriction for churches to only be at 1/3 capacity of, or maybe it's 1/2, but there's a capacity thing with that. But what it says in the current restrictions is you're at this capacity or 50, whichever is less.
Right.
The reason that's odd is because there's so many churches that can fit hundreds or even thousands of people inside.
Right.
Right. Now, if you don't know much about churches, but I have to wonder if the person who wrote this actually understands the nature of churches in Alberta, because it's so rational. There are a number of churches that can only fit 100 people inside. They only have 100 people in their congregation. So right. Half capacity or 50% or 50 people, that makes sense. It's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And I understand there's some churches that are so small, they only have 30 members, can only fit 50 inside their building. And so the purpose of that public health order in that context would be, well, we don't want all 50 crammed in there. We want you to keep it at half capacity. So there's spacing. That makes sense. I mean, at least if you think spacing makes sense.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, some of these churches in Edmonton and Calgary, they can fit 4,000 people inside, and we're saying,
yeah. Like my specific context, our church, our auditorium holds, I think 1,200 or 1,400 people. Not exactly sure. I'm the facility guy, but it, 1,200 people. We do 3 weekend services here. We have a 600-person auditorium on the south side, and then another church on White Ave that I think has 2 services around 80 to 100 people. So like the gamut of trying to do services again under the current restriction, it just doesn't even make sense. Like one of our churches would be able to open based on those restrictions with an additional service, but our 2 larger campuses basically are done until the NHL comes back, and we allow like bigger crowds to assemble. So it's really thrown a wrench into kind of what assembled church looks like for us. We're blessed as a bigger church to be able to do that, like through online services and engagement, and we have a strong team. But there's got to be churches I can't imagine that are in that kind of middle zone, 300 people that now have to look at doing 6 services just to get their people all through, because it's either 50 or 1/3 of capacity, whatever's smaller. So it's like that's a huge load to just kind of switch on to, and very arbitrary when you consider the breadth of what church expression or religious expression in assemblies means.
Yeah, the number is utterly arbitrary. If there's any science that supports these numbers, nobody I've talked to has seen it. I haven't seen it. The number is picked out of thin air, which is unfortunate. That's not how the law is. That's not how it should be. That's not the rule of law, right? Our jurisprudence takes arbitrariness very seriously, right? When it comes to protecting rights. So it's very frustrating, and I mean the irrationality and the arbitrariness of it is made all the more obvious by the fact that currently and for the last couple of weeks, restaurants were able to open at half capacity, regardless of
Yeah.
how many people that is and of how big their facility is. Now I get, obviously most restaurants are much smaller than some of these big churches, but the obvious implication is that there's going to be some restaurants that are going to have 75, 100 people in them, right? Because they're big
Right.
and they can actually fit that many at half capacity. Right.
Yeah.
So, why do restaurants, which, they don't have constitutional protection, and there's no way that's somehow more unsafe for public health for churches than it is for restaurants. People are coming and going. Things are getting touched. There's food involved. It doesn't make any sense. Right. And it's, and that's how a lot of people feel. So it's really frustrating, right? It's really frustrating to be treated in this childish fashion, like churches and Christians and faith people are being treated in Alberta, by this patronizing government that just says, well, we know what's best for you.
Yeah.
Like, well, it doesn't make any sense, and I don't like being treated this way because it just doesn't make any sense. That's why I hear that so much from people. It doesn't make any sense, And there's only so much patience for a government that keeps taking your rights away in a way that just doesn't make any sense. Often it doesn't, but you can understand sometimes, okay, that is the end of the limit for your right, because there's this thing over here that we got to worry about as government, that and this makes sense. I'll admit that I occasionally see rights violations that I don't like, but they at least make some sense. None of these do, and that makes it a whole lot worse.
So when it comes to actual practicing of the Christian faith, I'd like to ask you a couple questions about some of our practices, and then under the current restrictions, if you can clarify, because there is some questioning, if people haven't read the full Public Health Act, plus the Charter of Rights, plus have a sense of church history and stuff like that. What I'm trying to do is bridge that here. So baptisms, however they're performed, whether it's outside in a lake or in someone's hot tub or in a baptism font, here that the act, or even by sprinkling baptisms in those traditions, is that currently prohibited by the restrictions?
So the restrictions are they're currently called guidance for places of worship, and there's very few things in that guidance that are actually clearly mandatory or required.
Right.
It's full of a lot of suggestions, which is a little odd, just because that's practically so uncertain and unwieldy, right? I can tell you, normally laws are very clear when they're mandatory, when they're not, and of course they usually are. Sometimes something has to be engaged first, but even then it becomes mandatory, it becomes clear, right? It could be criminal law, it could be administrative law, it could be any kind of law, just like the laws we're dealing with now. They're clear and they're certain. You know when you're breaching them and when you're not. It's not actually law when the government says you should not do this. When the government says you must not do this, and it's written here in section yada yada of this particular legislation.
Yeah,
right.
I think that's an important distinction that a lot of pastors and laymen in the church perhaps didn't have that kind of that kind of background knowledge of how legislation and law works and how important it is when this kind of situation comes up. Because if it wasn't a legislative law, does the Public Health Act give them the authority to treat those guidelines and should nots as law? Because the big worry at the beginning of all this was the range of fines that seem to be associated with contravening these orders. It's like if the assembly was more than 15, it was a fine from starting at $1,000 up to $500,000, which is that's outrageous for anybody to sustain just because they went to church. And the vague kind of nature of how they kind of walk this out with arbitrary numbers, like you said, it's that's a real looming threat that could just all of a sudden come down onto a church. I don't think there's any church in Alberta that could sustain any one of its members, or none of its members could personally, I don't think, a $500,000 fine just for coming in for a baptism. But there is that kind of looming threat. It's like, well, are those fines still active? Like, are we talking about this, or is it just best practices? Because there's no hard and fast. At least if it was like, we've legislated that this will not happen during this pandemic, at least then it's like, okay, they mean business. We're going to be breaking laws and suffering those fines. But it's so vague that you don't know if it's going to happen or not. And the enforcement issue past that, it's like, well, there's hundreds of churches in the area. Like, how on earth would they administer that kind of fine to that many people if they all decided just to go to church? So yeah.
Just to go to your question, I'm looking at the guidance right now. I'm not seeing anything about.
Is that the? It's like a 2-page document guidance for religious things they released. I think it was like last week.
There's a new one, and it's quite a bit longer. And it tried to clarify a couple things. So I don't see anything about baptism actually. I've seen baptism named, I think, at least in the Ontario guidance, maybe in somewhere out east as well. I've looked at these all across the country, so they get a little muddled. But one thing I know is actually mandatory and likely enforceable by law is the 50-person or 1/3 capacity. I just checked; it's 1/3 capacity.
Right.
That is something that if somebody got a ticket for, it probably would be enforceable.
Right.
But most of what else is in there is it's suggestions and recommendations, which are not law and are not enforceable. And if a ticket was given for example, I mean, there's suggestions in there advising against communion.
That was my next question. Yeah, is communion?
In terms of that, I mean, if there was a ticket given because communion was served by a church, I mean, as a lawyer, my first argument would be, this isn't a law. It's not enforceable. No law has been broken. This ticket is invalid, right? I mean, I'd have a long list of arguments, but that'd probably be at the top.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, look, I get this, right? That there's the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and you need to consider both of them. And as a faith person who wants to respect political leaders and wants to honor people around them, they're going to take recommendations seriously, and that's an honorable thing to do, right? But it is important to understand that there is a distinction, right? And some recommendations are going to make more sense than others, and some are going to be more justified than others. And if for that religious person, that recommendation to violate their constitutional right doesn't meet a threshold for them, and maybe they feel like I can't follow that recommendation. I mean, if you told me I'd had to, I guess I would, even though I disagree because it's the law. But if you're going to recommend it to me, I'm not going to do it because my faith is more important. And that's a legitimate thing to keep in mind, I think. I don't think it's. I think it's appropriate to know when something is a recommendation or when it's actually a mandated, enforceable, clear law.
Yeah, the misinformation, or like the phone call game that everyone has, where like you're getting it like 3 people removed from the actual act, I found is something it's problematic when trying to develop policy here, because you're hearing it not from the source, you're hearing it from someone who read someone's interpretation of the source, or someone who had a conversation with someone who interpreted the source. And it's been very problematic being part of the reopening of kind of a large church in several regards. You touched on communion, and this is going to be one of the parts of the book I talked about, where the reason I'm doing these interviews, where I really want to try and figure out how we lost kind of like the focus on this. That there's a direction in scriptures for us to pray for the sick, for the elders to anoint them with oil. And I realized that as much as I had a gut check reaction to the prohibitions on singing, which I'd love to ask you about next, that one didn't really get touched by any major Christian online, for articles wise. But I realized that is one of those things where if elders showed up at a medical facility and tried to exercise that, where they have done previously ages before for people suffering from, illnesses or dying of cancer or anything like that, where they'd come, pray for the sick, anoint them with oil, like they're instructed to in the Bible. That kind of thing would be seen, at least in these times, with the amount of attention going towards COVID-19. I don't see how you could do that without getting the police called on you for violating the social distance, measures, for violating the like the quarantine measures for people who are sick. Like I don't see how that specific thing that we're encouraged and I would say commanded, depending on how you read the scriptures, for elders to do in the church. How would we? How does that fit into the kind of current restrictions? And would that be considered illegal for the elders of a church, 3 or 4 godly men who are running that church as the spiritual leadership, for them to try and pray for someone, let's say, who is, maybe on death's door with COVID-19?
Now you've really gotten to a tricky spot. The vast majority of these restrictions are utterly unjustifiable. And if I was able to get into court with this, hopefully I'd have some experts willing to speak to this, and I think I would, because I've already I've already heard some speak out, at least privately, to my group. If we got into court with this, we'd be able to show that most of this stuff is irrational, arbitrary, utterly unjustified, without scientific support. It's just a known fact that this thing is almost irrelevant for people under 60.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like the flu in that sense.
Yeah. Now,
when you get into the situation where you're actually dealing with some elderly people that have some comorbidities, then you're actually into something. You're into the realm of rationality all of a sudden. Finally.
Yeah.
We have seen that a number of people have died in nursing homes, right? Mm-hmm. This virus, has a statistically significant death rate amongst elderly people, and especially the ones that are in nursing homes, because they're the ones that have comorbidities, so they're more vulnerable, right? The last I saw of the numbers is that about 80% of the people, I don't know if this is just Alberta or if it's Canada, but 80% of the people that are dying of COVID in Canada. And of course, it's not a large number. But I mean, it's significant, and it's I think it's a few thousand, and I mean, even one is devastating for the people that are in that family. I mean, somebody dies of an illness, and you know them, you're their family. It's devastating. It doesn't matter if anybody else has died; your loved one has died. Right. But but we've seen that it's 80% of them are nursing homes, right? So that's where the government might be in a position to say, you know what, it's our obligation as a government to protect the lives of the members of our society, and it's an obligation on us to take measures to try and protect people. So we're not going to let people come into these nursing homes for X number of time, or X number of weeks or months, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of, or a hospital, like, let's say that there's
same thing with a hospital. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I mean, where it gets stickier, and here's where the government has not made any efforts to make this to make accommodations, is if you're in a hospital and you're terminal, you're in a hospice, you're in a circumstance like that. I mean, nursing home is trickier because there's other people. Let's say there's somebody in there who we know is terminal. They got 48 hours roughly to live.
Yeah.
But other people don't. But I mean, if you're in a hospital and you got somebody who's got 48 hours to live, they're terminal, they're going to die. It's inhumane and insufferable, potentially even evil, to not let at least a couple people in to see that person, to pray with that person, to say their goodbyes, right? Mm-hmm. The idea of human beings dying alone in a hospital bed is repulsive. It's repugnant. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be happening, right? Yeah. There are measures that especially a hospital could do to allow that to happen for the sake of human dignity, right? I've had pastors almost break down in tears with me when they're talking about the fact that they can't go and see people on their deathbed and pray with them. And that's one of the most important functions for some pastors. I think most pastors, but certainly some do it more than others. And that cuts me to the core, and it should be cutting anybody to the core. Yeah. I think most people can relate to that. I mean, I watched my grandparents die. One in a hospital bed and one at home. But in both cases, it was so fundamentally important that other people were there at that moment. As terrible and tragic as that moment is, as human beings, we understand the importance of somebody being there. Not, I understand some people die in a coma, and so there's, it's no benefit necessarily to them. They're not there. But even the idea of them dying alone in a coma with nobody being able to go and pray for them, for example, right?
Yep.
So I'm very disappointed, on a constitutional rights level, but on a human dignity level, I'm very disappointed, and to be honest, I'm very upset to see that there are elderly people dying alone, without
where it could have been avoided.
It didn't have to happen that way.
Yeah.
Like at that point, there's no concern or threat of them getting COVID, of course, right? And people who want to go and see them, they should be able to make that choice, but whether they want to.
That leads me to my next question: is do Canadians, specifically Albertans, kind of in this crisis and stuff like that, how do we navigate that decision? Like, do I have the right to put myself at risk to COVID if there's government restrictions dealing with the quarantining of an infectious disease? Because like our faith is built on the praying for the sick. Specifically with diseases much more disastrously worse without treatment, like leprosy. Like before there was a treatment for leprosy, that was your death sentence, and it was a horrible way to go and stuff like that. And physically so, like it degraded your body, you lost all feeling, all that kind of stuff. And we were told to, pray for lepers, lay hands on them, that kind of stuff. I couldn't help but feel like when it came to that, when I realized, wait, this isn't being addressed. That's why I wanted to write this book. Is that, are we at a point where we have to like wrestle with that as a faith? It's like, it doesn't matter if you have a right or not. Your faith calls you to put yourself at risk when it comes to like being exposed to COVID-19. Like maybe you are the exception. A 40-year-old who's got, great health, a great immune system and stuff, and you still catch this thing and end up dying. If that's the case, like we are called to, I think from scripture, at least approach that where it's like, yeah, there are inherent risks to our faith because we do pray for sick people. We do anoint them with oil. We do have contact where we do share meals with them. There's a fundamental kind of like non-quarantine part of our faith that's kind of interwoven everywhere. And then when it comes to this kind of stuff where someone might be dying of COVID-19 and you're a healthy pastor who's not, would there be a legal ramification if that person asked for their pastor to come and that pastor, broke in and did? Like, what would be what restrictions would be like held against them legally, and would there be, like legal precedent for them to do such thing from their faith?
Well, so much of what's going on there is no precedent for, in law and politics, even not a lot in history. Probably, as far as I know, the first time in history that we've, in large amounts, quarantined the healthy. For thousands of years, quarantining was a regular practice, but quarantined the sick.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of the underlying irrationalities to all this, and many people have noted that we've kind of flipped this on its head. Quarantining itself is not necessarily a bad idea. We've done that for a long time, but now we're quarantining millions of healthy people instead of a few 100 or 1,000 sick people.
Yeah.
That there's a lot of underlying philosophical things there, but if you break the law, you potentially suffer the consequences, right? Mm-hmm. So there are some, and I'll just give a brief explanation of this because this is important to understand for Canada. In Canada, it's possible for there to be laws that blatantly violate your constitutional rights, but that are still legitimate laws and upheld as legitimate laws because our Constitution actually allows the government to pass laws or to take action that does violate our rights.
Right.
And that's important for people to understand. I don't think most people understand that. I don't think they know that. I think maybe they're even surprised to hear that. That's certainly not how the Americans do things, for example, where their protection of their rights is absolute. Yeah. The reason that's good is because the government then can't therefore get away with violating that right.
Right.
That can make things difficult.
They have a reset button essentially. It's like, no, Constitution.
Yeah, and that's what the Americans do, and that's why they're a freer society, right? But it does create some messy problems, and
Oh
they
yeah,
have to
totally.
they deal with those problems, right? It's funny in Canada because we often kind of snub our noses at the fact that the Americans have these problems because their rights are absolute. We kind of almost pride ourselves on the fact that our rights are not absolute. We have to think about what that means. That means that our rights can be violated lawfully. I mean,
Right.
at some level, how valuable is a constitution, or how valuable are your constitutional rights if they can be violated, right? And at the end of the day, it's a judge who gets to decide if that violation was justified or not. You know,
Right.
there should be a sense of unease about the idea of whether or not your constitutional right actually protects you in this situation being up to a judge. Because I mean, look, the facts are that the judges do have what we call technically in the legal world attitudinal leanings, right?
Right. So you can have a judge who's a Christian and judges as a Christian. You can have a judge that's not a Christian and judges not as a Christian.
Well,
without
yeah, I
being
mean,
explicit.
That's a religious attitudinal approach, but I mean, there's at a more basic level, there's an ideological attitudinal approach.
Okay, I see.
Right. Some judges obviously take a more expansive view of constitutional rights. They just have a natural attitudinal predisposition in favor of individual liberty. Whereas others would have, and you can see this if you read the mental law that I do. You see this attitudinal predisposition towards statism or collectivism or big government or the benevolence of big government. And the idea when they do their balance, you see the legal scales. They put a little more weight on government intervention and a little less on individual liberty. And a different judge might put a little more on individual liberty and less on government intervention, and you get a different outcome. Right. So, I mean, obviously there's stare decisis, which is the idea that you have to follow precedents, and what the Supreme Court says is binding, but that doesn't cover everything in the law. Right. So all that to say, the trouble for people, I think, is, okay, I know my right is being violated. That's pretty clear. But I know the government is asserting a justification for violating that right.
Yeah.
And if I decide to break that law and the government tickets me and I go to court and I challenge that, I may win, I may lose, I don't know. Right? I may go to court and I may win. The court may say that rights violation is not justified, and therefore what you did, individual who broke the law, what you did is actually lawful, and you're vindicated. Right? Yeah. Or the judge may say, look, yes, your right was violated, but that rights violation is justified, and so you're going to be held accountable for breaking that law because that law is actually legitimate, right? Yeah. So it's extraordinarily risky, and now normally it's not so unknown, right? Normally, a person goes and gets legal advice, and the lawyer can pretty much say, yeah, you know what, that's probably going to be a justified rights violation. Don't do that.
Right.
It's hard to counsel right now in that sense, because it's hard for me to go to a church and say, oh yeah, don't do that. That's going to be a justified rights violation. Or yeah, you know what, that's not.
Right.
I look at this now, and most of the time I say it's not, but it's hard to know because this is so new, right? The freedom of assembly is one of the forgotten freedoms. All these situations have no factual precedent. I mean, the idea of a government saying to somebody, you can't go be with this person in their last hours, that's unheard of.
Right.
Right. And it's a severe violation of rights. And yet, I mean, if going to see that 85-year-old lady in a nursing home is going to potentially carry in a virus that has a significant death rate for the other 50, 85-year-olds in there who aren't necessarily dying, like could have a few years to live. There's something to be said for that, right? So to balance that is very, very difficult. And I guess for some people at the end of the day, maybe it's easy for them. They say, you know what, this is what my religion commands, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. Yeah. Come what may. But I think for most people, it's like, well, I want to do that, and I would do it if I thought it was lawful, but I can't do it knowing it's just at the end of the day, I'm not even going to have a good legal ground to fight it. I'm going to end up, being punished. And there's something to be said for, you want to you want to be responsible and reasonable and have a good image, right? I mean, if you're being reckless, even in the practice of your faith, and even in trying to uphold the human dignity of that one person, if you're doing it recklessly, well, that kind of defeats the purpose, right? If you recklessly go in and pray with one person and then 6 other people die because they got
Right.
that kind of virus that you brought in, that's the concern, right? I mean that's not it's not something we're seeing on a even if I mean we had all these lockdowns, all these restrictions, and I mean still the nursing homes, the virus got in, right? And people were dying in significant numbers. So it's a lot to weigh. It's a lot to balance. I'm sorry that was a long answer, but
it actually leads in, because like my initial knee-jerk reaction, why I really got started on like interviewing pastors and doing research for this book, was because of the singing. Because I was like, the second they said that singing is not allowed, I had this libertarian just knee-jerk actions, like you cannot tell people not to sing. And then I realized driving into work one day, I listen to very loud punk rock every day before work. Gets me going. It's like, I have to clean my windshield because I'm spitting on it. They're 100% right about the singing, but it's the principle. It's like, and that has to be held in tension. It's like, yeah, they're right. The singing could spread this, but they're also wrong in saying you can't sing. It could have been a you shouldn't, and this is that. It had to be held in tension, and it would have been, I think, a lot better. But we got ourselves into this situation where now it like all this stuff's bubbling up, and we have to question it because it was an approach that did leave that wasn't nuanced to the church, but affected the church almost exclusively for a lot of these things. Because yeah, I mean, congregational singing's not exactly screaming to punk, but yeah, it's like when you're driving east doing that, you can see how the water droplets, your breath droplets might travel, and it's like that's eye-opening in one regard. But the other regard is, it's still something that's essential to a religious experience. So yeah, that it wasn't held in tension, and that it wasn't kind of nuanced out because of how essential it is, in end of life situations, or from like a faith practice, like how conflicted you must be to either practice or not practice your faith. Like it really did affect us in a way that I don't think, like you said, there's really no precedent. There's no like factual basis for a lot of this stuff, and it's really this weird time we're living in. Like, how do we get here?
Yeah, the singing thing is unique. I mean, ultimately, in order to meet that threshold for demonstrating that it's justified to violate a particular right, the government's got to do a little more than say, oh, well, there's a slight chance of this, and it could do this. And they have to, I mean, the test, the legal test, the phrase is it has to be a pressing and substantial objective. And the means chosen to achieve that objective have to minimally impair the right in question. So a prohibition on singing doesn't mean that.
That's a complete impairment. Like
it's a complete impairment. It's it's taking a sledgehammer to nail in a finishing nail, right?
Yeah.
And actually these sorts of analogies are used. I remember one particular judge at the Supreme Court. The language he uses that it should be a scalpel. And you don't take a hacksaw at people's rights. If you're gonna violate their right to achieve something that's pressing and substantial, it's going to be a scalpel. You're going to carve out just a little bit that you have to in order to achieve this. Right?
Yeah.
And if it's more than that, it's too much. I don't care how pressing and substantial this is. If you're taking a hacksaw to people's rights to achieve it, it's not justified, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, the government, if it was that important to them, could do a better job, right? Yeah. If I mean, of course, the precursor to that whole test is going to be rational. Right. There's several stages to this test of the government meeting its burden, and the onus always is on the government to justify to the court. The burden is on them to show the court that this rights violation is justified. One of the preliminary steps is it has to be rational, right? The vast majority of this is irrational, right? A blanket prohibition on singing is irrational. If let's say somebody was actually sitting down and intelligently doing this and said, okay, your church can't sing if people are in attendance above the age of 60. Or let's take that. Now we're actually getting into something that's worth arguing about. Okay, we know there's a statistically significant death rate of people above 60. Well, we know there's at least a little bit of evidence with the singing. I mean, your anecdotal evidence is in line with the anecdotal evidence that the government has offered. You know, they anecdotally offered evidence of a choir where people got infected, although upon investigation,
yeah, like singing Ave Maria is very different than, you know, belting out Blink 182. I just want to.
Yeah, congregational singing is yeah, exactly, right. So again, this is where the scalpel comes in. Let's say, you know, let's say the government says no choir singing if anybody in the choir is above 60, but you can do congregational singing as long as everybody's distanced, right? Like there's all these different ways you could work this out to keep the rights infringement minimal instead of maximal, which is what it is right now.
Yeah.
We're seeing hacksaws and sledgehammers from the government.
Do you know who that quote's from? The scalpel as opposed to a hacksaw, or is that just kind of general? Because that is golden. I would love to include that in the book because it illustrates this point perfectly.
I could probably find it, but I don't remember the name of the judge. This would be an older case. I think this would have been in probably 20, 30 years ago.
Off to Google.
I could probably find it for you, but I know I'm constantly quoting judges, but I can't remember the name of the person who said it. Justice McLaughlin, I sometimes can because she ruled in so many, but a lot of the other ones I can't. But yeah, that's one of the problems here, is that it's just you know. But I mean, normally government gets to think for a while about a law, and normally law or any kind of government action goes through some process of deliberation and criticism. This is why the legislative function is so important, right? This is why even if it's your government in power, you don't want them passing a law without the other guys being able to tear it apart, because that's how it gets better. That's how these blind spots are exposed, right?
Right.
With the legislature shut down, the legislative function of government is gone, and that's been morphed in with the executive, and so you see these abuses of power, and you see these arbitrary rules, and you see that they're not thought out, they're irrational. Well, that's inevitable, right? The whole reason we have this division of powers between the executive and the legislative is so that the executive isn't able to just make laws willy-nilly, because if it does, it looks like it does right now. This is what it looks. This is what it looks like when you have a bunch of people ruling arbitrarily, right? We don't have governance right now in most of Canada, right? Yeah. Like, you know, the courts are closed down, the legislatures aren't functioning. We're having arbitrary rule oftentimes by one unelected government bureaucrat, like the chief medical officer.
Right. And
so the fact that we're seeing so many irrational orders doesn't surprise me, because that's inevitable, right?
Yeah, this is Civics 101. That there were checks and balances for a reason, and like if you don't know that, then this is what you end up with. It's funny that you bring up the medical officer. I'm actually quite concerned for her. Were you familiar with the tattoo artist who did the art piece about her? CTV did it a while ago. I'll have to send it to you. So this tattoo artist did an art piece where he portrayed her as Joan of Arc, or similar to Joan of Arc. It was very clear imagery. She was dressed in 18th century armor or whatever it was. Had a caduceus, like the medical symbol staff, and Alberta flag and stuff like that. I'm like, that is brilliant beyond expression, because she is kind of like the savior right now until the government needs to atone for all the arbitrary stuff that's being happened. And then who else are they going to lift up? And I'm like, I'm so worried for that woman, because as much as I might disagree with some of the things she's done, it's like, yeah, with it being arbitrary, I mean, someone's got to pay that bill at the end of the day. Like, it's going to come to a point, I fear, and poor Hinshaw's been lifted up like that, and to reference it to Joan of Arc, who the same thing happened, was lifted up and then, burned at the stake later. It's like, it was so brilliant that he picked up on that. But also it's like, yeah, this is still someone who needs the grace of God, who's doing the best she can, I think. But because there isn't that check and balance of the legislative process, it is just arbitrary, and it's like that's gonna have consequences. I'll send you the picture in the article. It was mind blowing when I saw it.
That raises. an important and fascinating point, because I think it goes back to this whole thing of democracy, the rule of law, elections, the division of powers, because that's just it. When you give arbitrary rule to one person, elected or not, but especially non-elected, it's not just terrible for the people being arbitrary ruled, it's potentially terrible for that person, right?
Yeah,
They're being asked to do something that's not humanly possible. Right?
Yeah, what's the Kanye line? No one man should have all that power. You're like, just.
Yeah, we know that. We've been learning that for 1,000 years in our history, right? We know that. We've learned that over and over. I mean, the amount of blood that's been spilled to figure that out, right? I mean, we're throwing out lessons that we've taken hundreds of years and millions of lives to learn about.
Yep.
Right. All in a matter of a few days of hysteria in response to something that, I mean, obviously we know more now than we knew back then.
Yeah.
But you still have to question the hysteria in March about this.
Yeah.
Right.
That's also why I want to write a book on this.
Like in Florence in the 1300s when the plague came once, there was 120,000 people in that city. Plague came through, and a few weeks later there was 20,000. 100,000 people died. Right. That's like, what is that? Like 85% of the city was dead in weeks. Right. Like people, like if there's some hysteria in Florence in response to that, it's understandable. I mean, it's almost calls for. I mean, panic and run for the hills is almost the best advice to give into anybody. People acted in March as if that's what we were facing, and that was just patently obvious that it was not.
Right.
Right. I know we know more now than we know then, but we knew then that this was not the plague of the 1350s.
Yeah. And that's why I want to do these interviews and get as much information to write a book, because I think that reactionary response didn't help things. Like when you have bloggers addressing it as if they've got the final, solution to figure out a week into this, just to get contradicted 2 weeks into this, just to get rearranged a month into this. Like we're 5 levels deep on, we think we've got this thing figured out. We don't have a year's worth of data. And so one of the last chapters I had planned is like, okay, here are the actual stats after a year, which is why, we needed to process through this, as a church, and as a faith, to build like a theology of response to this. Because it was a panic. It was a panic and a crisis. And there was a lot of hysteria, where there really wasn't just like a step back and like, yes, some people are going to die inside of a certain amount of time. There's no stopping that. So let's rationally look at that and see what this is actually going to turn into before we start making decisions. And that approach it'd be too hard, I think, to figure out what the cost of life would have been to that approach. But what wouldn't have happened is some of the rights violations that we saw and some of the precedents that we set by, allowing that to happen without any kind of, protest, to it. So.
The reality people need to understand, whether they're of a faith background is not, is that history shows that most of the times a government tries to fix a problem, they actually make it worse.
Yeah.
And we've seen that yet again. In the end, when this is all over, I will be surprised if the amount of human suffering from the actual virus itself, from COVID-19, exceeds the human suffering imposed by the lockdown, right? I certainly for me and many others, I'm not persuaded that the lockdown did much, if even anything, to prevent human suffering, in the sense that it actually prevented further deaths from COVID. I mean, it didn't prevent them in the nursing homes, right? That happened regardless, and probably would have happened and about the same severity, because it was severe. I mean, nursing homes, some of them were ravaged. So, I mean, the amount of suicides and unemployment and chronic conditions and abuse and divorces, and I mean, it just
even just depression. I mean, when you're locked away from people.
the long-term effect of this on people's lives is debt. I mean, some people have lost their life efforts in their business, their life savings, their life earnings. They're not going to come back to a job. I mean, the amount of human suffering from that's all imposed by the government. That's not imposed by COVID.
Yeah,
right?
It wasn't a fear of the government. It was almost a fear of getting fined and weighing those options. Like, do I suffer potentially, a $500,000 fine to continue my, my landscaping business when we're supposed to be shut down, or do I just, accept the loss this year and potentially go bankrupt? So yeah.
So I think that's something important to keep in mind, that if it had just been some targeted measures to try and protect the vulnerable, and otherwise, let society. This goes back to your whole thing about should people be free to take that risk, right?
Yeah.
Free society is full of a lot of risks, right?
Yeah.
You get a free society without some risk, and most people fundamentally recognize that, right? I mean, any attempts in history to take away this risk to try and create a utopia has resulted in the opposite. It's resulted in dystopias, right? The dystopias of the 20th century, in which millions of people were murdered by tyrannical regimes, they were the result of attempts to create a utopia, right? That's what the Russians and the German and the Chinese are still trying to do, is to create a utopia, right? And the sad thing is, in the process, we see a dystopia where millions of lives are lost and millions of lives are ruined, right? Because they don't have freedom, and without freedom, you ultimately can't have human dignity. I mean, we have this idea that we can centralize planning and control and make everything better for people. Well, we can't. Human beings can't do that. Only God can do that. Right? I don't care whether you believe in God or not. The concept of God is able to do that. Human beings.
You would need a supreme power so far above humanity that it can't be questioned in order to have that kind of control. And that anytime you put a man in there, he's just supremely unqualified. He can't possibly keep up, can't possibly know everything. There's a reason why you want God in control of where you want a God in control. Anytime you put man in there, it doesn't work.
It's one of the reasons we rejected kings as a legitimate form, right? The British worked this out hundreds of years ago. It's why now we don't want just Kenny running the show. We don't want just Hinshaw running the show. We want there to be the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and they're all keeping each other in check, and there's balances, and no one person is calling all the shots, because they can't.
Because exactly. I want to respect time. I've got two more questions, unless you're good to keep going. First, one to deal with kind of the practicality of churches as a workplace. So our church has around 60 staff. Where does a church stop being a religious institution and a place of worship and become a place of, like, a workplace or a place of business, even though we're a nonprofit? Like, how do we interact with that, with the restrictions and stuff like that? Because in one regard, like, the religious guidelines give us kind of leeway in one space, and then in another regard, it's like, well, are we a nonprofit or a business? Because, like, we do have an office, we have a copy room, we have a whole wing full of offices for pastors and admins, and none of that is biblically mandated. It's all like just how we run this building. Like, my entire role is not a biblical office. I fix toilets and rooftop air conditioning units and carpet. Like, so that's not in the Bible. It's not a religious right to do that. I want to respect that. But it's like, where's that divide in this kind of with the restrictions and stuff?
Well, I mean, I think it's both, right? I think, a church in the sense that you're describing it, right, with all these administrative functions and facility functions, it is a workplace, right? I mean, for you, it's exactly as you said, right? You could be doing this job anywhere else. I mean, obviously, you might derive some less personal theological satisfaction out of it, but it's that type of job, right? So I think for the workplace guidance, because there is a workplace guidance for employers and employees and all that sort of stuff, insofar as those things make sense, and some of them do, some of them don't, then I think it's fine. I think it's fine to say your staff should be taking these measures, and the church as an employer should be taking these measures with their staff. A good example would be, you got a staff member who's watched a little too much news and is just utterly terrified of this thing. Well, as an employer, you have an obligation to not just turf them because you think they're being ridiculous. You're not, and that applies to a church as much as it does to a non-religious nonprofit or a business or anywhere else. It's a little trickier with a business, obviously, if they perform some sort of function that is required for your business. I mean, at some point you have to get involved. They're not going to come to work. But still, regardless of the context, there's maybe varying degrees, but you have to show some patience. You have to show some compassion. And I mean, look, if the Public Health Act says these people, if they were exposed or have symptoms, or should be self-isolating. Well, I mean, as an employer, you got to honor that, right? You might disagree with that. You might want to, challenge that law politically and say, I don't think this makes any sense. But in the meantime, yeah, I mean, you don't fire somebody because they said, well, I was around somebody that was exposed to it or traveling out of the country, so I need to go home for 14 days and I can't work, right? So I think it's fine. Is
it kind of a both and, like, so? Like,
I think churches, I mean, when they're like your church, they have all these non-religious functions that I think there's some legitimacy in them being regulated to a degree. It can become undue, but to a degree to be regulated, like, this is just like any other organization. I mean, it's not a business. Church is not a business, right?
Yeah.
It's a nonprofit. It's an organization. It's not a business. But I mean, a lot of the same function. You have offices, you have computers, you have staff that could go work in a business, the transferable skills. Like, that's that environment. Yeah, I don't see an issue with that insofar as they're applied, equally across the board. And insofar as they're not undue interference that somehow touches on the religious stuff, and insofar as they make sense, right? I mean, the government should not. We've gotten to this place in Canada, unfortunately, but the government should not have its fingers in everything. It shouldn't be micromanaging and regulating everything. I mean, there's too much of it in Canada to begin with, and that's part of the problem here. So it goes too far. But there's some at some point there's some legitimate regulation of that sort of stuff, right? So.
Yeah. My final question, and this kind of takes us into the kind of like brass tacks of it. Are you aware of any religious institutions in Alberta that have been fined or have had action taken against them because of like violating the restrictions or vice versa, or like just dealing with this?
Well, as of today, June 3rd, I'm not aware. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but I'm not aware. And if it has happened, I think it likely that I'd be aware or become aware rather quickly. So I guess I can only speculate, but I think it's an informed guess that there has not been any tickets issued to churches or to people manifesting or practicing their religion in Alberta. The only tickets one caveat I would say to that is I am aware of a street preacher who got a ticket in April, and the officer who gave him the ticket claimed that him and two people with him who were sort of handing out tracts and stuff, they were using long poles to do so, right? Because the officer alleged that they weren't maintaining physical distancing. I mean, they're on a very large sidewalk, and they have evidence they were maintaining distancing. I mean, they were purposely trying to maintain distancing. Yeah, it's probably the only minor example I've seen of somebody. I mean, he was manifesting his faith by being out there preaching.
Yep.
So that was what I thought at the time, and I still think, obviously, an abuse of public health orders to specifically discriminate against the practice of religion.
Right.
But I have not seen that extended to churches or people attending churches or anything like that. Yet. I mean, okay. There hasn't been a lot of examples, right? I mean, very few churches have at least up until very recently, have been continuing to meet in contravention. Yeah. So they haven't been inviting tickets, right?
Yeah.
And maybe there's a few small churches of 25 people way out in the middle of nowhere who have just continued to meet with 25 people.
Yeah, I had mentioned to you, I think, like my mom's church, I don't think had any stops because like their church is small. In New Brunswick, it's a rural church. There's 20 people who go to it. They have like 4 light bulbs and a wood stove. Like they're like they're not going to stop. It's a small country chapel. No one knows anyone who was affected by this. So like they're so far removed. You know, it's.
I've heard reports from Manitoba and BC that there's some smaller churches there that they didn't stop meeting, and they had numbers and content, you know, larger than the restriction.
Mm.
Nobody knew.
Yep. Well,
So,
yeah, well, it's strange times. I really appreciate getting a chance just to talk to you about kind of where we're at as a province, to really kind of nail down what the restrictions are and aren't, given how much kind of not misinformation, but just kind of an ignorance, like corporately as a faith, that we might have when it comes to dealing with the political side, charter rights, all that kind of stuff. Do you want to put one more plug since it's going on YouTube for your organization, or?
Sure. You know, like I said, the Justice Center functions on voluntary donations, right? We can only do what we do because people are generous and they give. So, you know, if you're somebody who's listening that supports the work we do, that supports the value of rights being defended when they're violated, by all means, consider donating, because, you know, we have grown over time. It's allowed us to litigate more cases, and we could grow more and litigate more cases and protect more people's rights, and we'd love to be able to do so. So that's my humble plug for supporting the Justice Center and what we're doing.
Awesome. I appreciate the time, and thank you for kind of walking us through that. And I'll let you know how the book kind of develops. Right now, I've got a couple more interviews to do, a mountain of like articles that I have to go through and stuff like that. But the plan is to kind of write a book that deals with these theological issues and walks us through like how the church can have a nuanced approach to this kind of life event that's kind of counter to the one size fits all that we got from the government. How we can like have a nuanced approach to the healing afterwards, all that kind of stuff. Because if we're without those principles, if we're just kind of all separately doing our best, then we're scattered, and we won't have a good response and a good way to kind of be the body of Christ anymore. So awesome. Appreciate your time.
You're welcome. That was fun.
Yeah. So